For Liberty and Glory, Washington, Lafayette, and Their Revolutions by James R. Gaines. So this book is about the relationship between George Washington and the Marquis de Lafayette. If you're unfamiliar, I'll try and give some background briefly. Lafayette was a young French nobleman who fought in the American War of Independence and the American Revolution as an aide to General George Washington, and he was George Washington's protege. If you're an American like me, you probably remember hearing briefly about Lafayette in your American history class. At least I did. He's very positively regarded in America. There are towns in America named after Lafayette. In my American education, the story of Lafayette ended after the American Revolution. But I've been interested to find out recently, I've been reading about the French Revolution, that Lafayette had a whole separate career after the American Revolution. He was one of the major figures in the French Revolution. At one time, he was the most prominent figure in the French Revolution. And then he wasn't, because the French Revolution had a number of turnovers. But at least for a time he was. And during the 1830 Revolution, much later, he again was one of the most prominent figures. So it's been interesting to kind of see that Lafayette continued to have a prominent role in world history after the American Revolution. And when I saw this book in the bookstores, Washington, Lafayette, and Their Revolutions, I thought, this will be interesting. So I picked it up. Now, the book has a lot to cover. It's one single book, but it's trying to do the biographies of two different men. And also two different revolutions. So there is a lot of information in here. At times, you feel like you're just getting brief glimpses of each man instead of the full biographical treatment. But like any good writer, James R. Gaines possesses the ability to skim through history and pick out the most interesting parts without getting bogged down in the details. Now, James R. Gaines is not a historian by profession. He's a journalist and he's a former magazine editor. And he obviously is bringing those skills to bear on this book. You feel like you're reading something that's written by a professional journalist rather than a historian. He also has an eye for picking out interesting details and digressions. For example, there's a lot written in this book about the relationship between Pierre Beaumarchais, who's the author of The Barber of Seville and the Figaro plays, and the Chevalier d'Eon, a sexually confused French spy. By the way, apologies as always for mispronouncing all those French names. Surprisingly, these interesting characters did have a very big impact on the American Revolution, and it's an interesting story, and Gaines has an eye for going into these interesting stories. There's a lot of interesting tidbits about George Washington in this book as well. Yeah, you know, it struck me as I was reading this book how little I really knew about George Washington. I mean, I knew all the legends, the cherry tree, the wooden teeth, most of which is apocryphal anyways. Well, definitely apocryphal in the case of the cherry tree. But I didn't really know any details about the man behind the myth, which is surprising given how revered he is in American mythology. But I think that's true for most of us. We Americans don't really know all that much about George Washington. So it was interesting to learn about it. Gaines gives us a good look at the man behind the myth. It's a mostly reverential portrait of America's father, but he doesn't shy away from some of Washington's eccentricities and blunders. For example, Gaines quotes from some of George Washington's early letters and comments that given how great a man Washington would later become, these letters show us more than we would wish to know about the young George Washington. I believe he uses the word hysterical or histrionics when talking about Washington's early letters. Washington thought that he was being passed over for greatness and promotion, or in being given assignments, and produced some rather high-strung letters and as a result. Gaines also writes about how Washington's first military command was to preside over a massacre at the outbreak of the French-Indian War, another detail that's often left out of American history classes. And there's a lot of biographical information about Lafayette in here as well. Now, if you, like me, didn't know much about Lafayette's career after the American Revolution, it's interesting to read how for a brief time he was the most powerful man in France in the early stages of the French Revolution. And then once the French Revolution started to descend into chaos, Lafayette crossed the border and surrendered himself to the Austrian army. And then he spent 6 years in the Austrian prison, but he survived and would later become one of the leading figures during the 1830 Revolution in France. Now, I've recently read another book which talked about the relationship between the French and American Revolution, The Great Upheaval by Jay Winnick, and I've reviewed that book on this channel as well. I'm going to talk briefly about the comparisons between both books. This may be of interest only to me, since I'm the one who's read both of these books, but if you'll indulge me, or you can stop the video here, either way. Both books cover roughly the same time period. Both books are obviously mining a lot of the same materials, because it's interesting to see a lot of the same quotations pop up in both books. That being said, there's enough different material to make it worthwhile reading each book on its own. For example, as I mentioned in my review of The Great Upheaval, Jay Winnick completely neglects Lafayette's role in the American and French revolutions, and Gaines focuses on it almost exclusively. Both books contrast the chaos of the French Revolution with the stable American government and the stable transition of power that the American Revolution created. Now, to a large extent, this is something that's worth focusing on, because you know, if you focus only on the American Revolution, you maybe get the impression that revolutions are largely stable transitions of power, whereas I think the American Revolution is the exception to the rule. The French Revolution, where the revolution just descended into chaos, is much more likely the way that revolutions tend to play out. So it's worth highlighting those differences, maybe to highlight how unusual the American Revolution is. That being said, I dislike it when Americans get a bit smug about this. I had an American history teacher back in high school who had a tendency to do this, you know, talk about how great America is, how terrible France is, and contrast the different revolutions. I think it is a contrast that's worth pointing out, but you want to talk about the historical circumstances that led to these differences. You don't want to talk about how Americans are inherently superior to French. It's maybe a fine line to walk, and I think Gaines' prose and the patriotic language he uses, he seems to almost fall into this trap of having a smug sense of American superiority, but I think he walks the line just enough. That being said, Gaines is no reactionary patriot. Like Winnick in The Great Upheaval, Gaines is using some historical parallels to subtly criticize the Iraq War. So this book came out about 10 years ago when the Iraq War was still a thing. For example, Gaines praises the wisdom of America's founding fathers in wanting to stay out of foreign wars. He contrasts this with the French Revolution's disastrous attempt to bring Republican governments into other countries by military force. Now, Gaines never mentions the Iraq War directly, but his choice of language leaves the readers into no doubt about what he's criticizing, especially given the time that this book came out.